There was nothing special about the horse. At least, that's what everyone believed. He wasn't born on a famous thoroughbred farm in Kentucky. He wasn't worth thousands of dollars. He had never won a race. He wasn't even bred for the sport that would eventually make him famous. To almost everyone who saw him, he was simply another workhorse. Strong, reliable, replaceable. By the late 1950s, America had begun changing. For generations, horses had powered farms across the country. They plowed fields, pulled wagons, and did the jobs that kept family farms running. But machines were taking over. Tractors could work longer, faster, and without needing food or rest. Almost overnight, thousands of horses that had spent their lives helping people were no longer needed. Many were sold. Others found new homes. Some weren't so lucky. One of those horses was a gray gelding named Snowman. He had spent years working on an Amish farm in Pennsylvania. There were no grandstands, no trophies, no photographers waiting for him after a hard day's work. His life was simple. Every morning he woke up, worked until the day was over, and did it all again the next morning. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. Then one day, everything changed. His owner no longer had a use for him. Snowman was loaded onto a truck with several other horses and sent to a horse dealer in New Holland, Pennsylvania. To most people, that wouldn't have meant much. To people in the horse business, it often meant the end. Around that same time, a Dutch immigrant named Harry de Leer was trying to build a riding school in New York. Harry had survived World War II in Nazi-occupied Holland before immigrating to the United States with almost nothing. He worked incredibly hard to build a new life, and like many riding instructors just starting out, he couldn't afford expensive horses. Instead, he drove to livestock auctions looking for bargains. Most of the horses he bought weren't champions. They were ordinary horses that simply needed another chance. One day, Harry arrived at the New Holland horse auction looking for a quiet horse that could be used for beginner riding lessons. He wasn't searching for a future champion. He was looking for something cheap. As he walked through the auction, one horse caught his attention, not because it looked extraordinary, because it looked calm. While other horses were nervous and restless, the gray gelding stood quietly in the corner. Harry later said there was something about the horse's expression that made him stop and look twice. It wasn't confidence. It wasn't beauty. It was kindness. The horse looked gentle. Exactly what a riding school needed. Harry bought him for $80. Even in the 1950s, that wasn't much money for a horse. Certainly not for one that anyone expected to accomplish great things. Harry loaded the gray gelding into his trailer and drove back to New York. He named him Snowman. At first, everything seemed promising. Snowman was calm, friendly, easy to handle. But there was one problem. He wasn't very interested in being a lesson horse. Beginner riders would climb into the saddle, and Snowman simply wasn't cooperative. He seemed bored, unmotivated, sometimes stubborn. Harry had a riding school to run, and a horse that wouldn't reliably carry beginners wasn't much use. After giving him several chances, Harry made a difficult decision. He sold Snowman back to the same horse dealer for roughly the same $80 he had originally paid. Business was business. Not every horse works out. Harry watched the trailer pull away. He believed he'd never see Snowman again. If the story had ended there, nobody would remember either of them. But fate has a strange way of giving people second chances. Just a short time later, Harry heard something that stopped him cold. The dealer wasn't planning to resell Snowman. He was shipping him to slaughter. Suddenly, that quiet gray horse wasn't just another lesson horse that hadn't worked out. He was a horse running out of time. Harry didn't hesitate. He climbed into his truck and drove as fast as he could. Not to buy another horse, to save one he had already let go. And that decision would change both of their lives forever. Harry reached the horse dealer before it was too late. Snowman was still there. The gray gelding had no idea what was happening around him. He didn't know Harry had changed his mind. He didn't know how close he had come to disappearing forever. All he knew was that the familiar man who had once owned him was standing in front of him again. Harry bought him back immediately. For the second time, Snowman climbed into Harry's trailer. This time, neither of them knew they would never be separated again. Harry drove back to his riding school convinced of one thing. Snowman wasn't going to be a lesson horse. He would simply live out the rest of his life on the farm. After everything he'd been through, Harry felt he had earned that much. There was no grand plan, no dream of championships, no hidden belief that Snowman possessed extraordinary talent. Harry simply couldn't bear the thought of such a gentle horse ending up at slaughter. Sometimes the greatest stories begin with nothing more than a simple act of kindness. Over the next few weeks, Snowman settled into life on the farm. He wandered the fields peacefully. He watched the riding lessons from a distance. And whenever Harry worked around the property, Snowman followed. It didn't matter where Harry went. The gray gelding always seemed to appear nearby. At first, Harry thought it was coincidence. Then it kept happening. If he repaired a fence, Snowman was there. If he walked across the property, Snowman quietly walked behind him. The horse that supposedly wasn't interested in people had become attached to the man who had saved his life. Harry later joked that Snowman behaved more like a dog than a horse. The bond between them grew stronger every day. Then something unusual happened. One afternoon, Harry placed Snowman in a paddock surrounded by a fence nearly 5 feet high. There was plenty of grass, fresh water, no reason to leave, yet only a short time later, Harry looked outside and couldn't believe what he was seeing. Snowman was standing beside the barn. Somehow he had escaped. Harry assumed someone must have left the gate open. He walked Snowman back to the paddock, carefully latched the gate, and returned to work. A little while later, there was Snowman again, standing outside, looking perfectly content. The gate was still closed. Harry checked every section of the fence. Nothing was broken. There were no gaps, no holes, no explanation. So he watched. As Snowman approached the fence, he expected the horse to stop. Instead, Snowman gathered himself, lifted off the ground, and cleared the entire fence with ease. Harry stood frozen. This wasn't a thoroughbred racehorse. It wasn't a horse trained to jump. It was a former farm horse that had spent years pulling equipment through fields. Yet he had just floated over the fence as though he'd been doing it his entire life. Harry immediately had a thought. What if? The next day, he led Snowman into a small arena. Using a couple of wooden rails, Harry built a tiny practice jump. Nothing difficult, just enough to see what would happen. Snowman walked toward it. Without hesitation, he jumped it effortlessly, not awkwardly, not clumsily, effortlessly. Harry raised the rails a little higher. Snowman jumped them again, higher, again, higher, again. Each time the gray gelding looked more comfortable. There was no fear, no confusion. It almost seemed as though Snowman had been waiting for someone to ask him. Harry couldn't believe what he was seeing. The horse that couldn't interest beginner riders. The horse he had nearly sent away forever. Had a natural gift that nobody had ever discovered. Word began spreading around the stable. People came to watch the old workhorse jump. Most expected to laugh. Instead, they left shaking their heads. Because this wasn't normal. Snowman wasn't simply clearing fences. He was making difficult jumps look easy. Every day, Harry became more convinced that he had stumbled onto something extraordinary. There was only one way to find out for sure. Take Snowman to a real horse show. The problem was, nobody else believed a former plow horse belonged there. The trailers arriving at competitions carried expensive, purpose-bred show jumpers worth thousands of dollars. Snowman had been bought for $80. He didn't have the bloodlines. He didn't have the reputation. He didn't even have the right breeding for the sport. On paper, he didn't belong. But horse shows aren't won on paper. They're won in the arena. And before long, the horse everyone dismissed as worthless was about to shock an entire sport. Harry entered Snowman in a small local horse show. He wasn't expecting a miracle. He wasn't even expecting a victory. His only goal was to see whether Snowman truly belonged in the sport. The moment they arrived, people noticed him. Not because he looked like a future champion, because he didn't. The trailers around them carried beautifully bred show jumpers. Many had been imported from Europe. Others had been purchased for thousands of dollars. They had impressive pedigrees, professional riders, years of specialized training. Then there was Snowman, the former Amish workhorse, the horse that had nearly been shipped to slaughter. The horse Harry had bought for just $80. To many people, he looked completely out of place. Some competitors couldn't believe Harry had entered him. Others smiled politely, assuming the gray gelding wouldn't last very long. No one expected him to be a serious threat. Harry wasn't offended. If he had seen Snowman only a few months earlier, he probably would have thought the same thing. Then the competition began. Snowman entered the ring quietly. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't excited. He simply waited for Harry's instructions. The first jump came. Snowman cleared it effortlessly. The second, just as easy. The third, perfect. As the course became more difficult, something unexpected happened. While other horses began making mistakes, Snowman looked more comfortable with every obstacle. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't forcing anything. He simply seemed to understand exactly what Harry wanted him to do. By the end of the course, spectators who had barely noticed him at the beginning were now watching every jump. The old farm horse had just defeated horses worth hundreds of times more than he had cost. And it wasn't luck. He kept doing it. One show became another, then another. Soon people weren't asking, "Who is that horse?" They were asking, "How much did that horse cost?" When Harry answered, $80, most people thought he was joking. They would laugh. Harry wouldn't, because he knew exactly where Snowman had come from. Every victory made the story more unbelievable. The former plow horse wasn't just competing anymore. He was becoming one of the best show jumpers in the country. Reporters started writing about him. Photographers wanted pictures. Crowds began arriving early just to watch the gray gelding jump. The underdog story spread far beyond the horse world. Newspapers loved it. America loved it. It was the kind of story people needed. A horse nobody wanted. Finding a second chance. Harry often said that Snowman never seemed interested in proving people wrong. He simply loved to jump. That joy became obvious whenever they entered the arena. Some horses hesitate before difficult fences. Snowman attacked them with confidence. The higher the jumps became, the happier he seemed. Soon, Harry and Snowman were no longer winning local competitions. They were competing against the very best riders and horses in America. Many of those horses had been bred specifically for show jumping. Snowman hadn't. Many had been trained for years by professionals. Snowman hadn't. Many had cost fortunes. Snowman had cost less than a television. Yet somehow, he kept beating them. One victory in particular changed everything. The prestigious American Gold Cup was one of the biggest prizes in American show jumping. Winning it could define an entire career. Most people expected one of the expensive European-bred horses to take the title. Instead, Snowman delivered a flawless performance. When the final jump was behind him, Harry looked at the scoreboard. They had done it. The $80 horse had won one of the most prestigious competitions in the country. There was no denying it anymore. Snowman wasn't just a good story. He was one of America's elite show jumpers. But the trophies weren't what made him famous. It was what happened after the competitions. Because while most championship horses returned to expensive barns, surrounded by grooms and handlers, Snowman always seemed interested in only one person, Harry. Their friendship became almost as famous as their victories. And before long, the entire country would fall in love with both of them. By the early 1960s, Snowman had become something nobody could have imagined just a few years earlier. Not just a champion, a phenomenon. People who had never attended a horse show before were buying tickets just to watch the gray gelding jump. Newspapers across America told his story. Television crews wanted interviews. Children asked to meet him. In a sport usually dominated by expensive, carefully bred horses, America's newest star had started life pulling plows. The contrast made him impossible to ignore. Every competition seemed to produce another unbelievable headline. The horse bought for $80 had beaten another field of elite show jumpers. The horse that had nearly been sent to slaughter had won another major title. The story almost sounded too perfect to be true. But every victory only made it more real. Snowman's greatest strength wasn't that he jumped higher than every other horse. It was consistency. Week after week, competition after competition. He proved that his success wasn't luck. He belonged at the very top of the sport. Then came one of the greatest honors an American show jumper could receive. In 1960, Snowman was named the American Horse Shows Association Horse of the Year. The following year, he won it again. Then, incredibly, he won it a third consecutive time. 3 straight Horse of the Year titles. No one was talking about the $80 horse anymore. They were talking about one of the greatest show jumpers in America. For Harry Dwyer, every trophy carried the same reminder. If he hadn't changed his mind, none of it would have happened. No championships, no packed arenas, no newspaper stories, no Snowman. One decision had changed both of their lives. As Snowman's fame grew, something else became obvious. The relationship between horse and rider was unlike anything people had seen. Harry wasn't simply riding a talented horse. He was riding his best friend. Snowman trusted Harry completely. At exhibitions, Harry could often ride him without the heavy equipment people normally expected. Sometimes Snowman followed Harry around the grounds without needing to be led. Photographers loved moments like that. Not because they were dramatic, because they were genuine. You could see the bond between them. It wasn't something that had been trained. It had been earned. People often asked Harry what made Snowman so special. Was it his breeding, his natural athletic ability, his intelligence? Harry usually gave a much simpler answer. He believed Snowman had never forgotten the second chance he'd been given. Whether that was true or not, watching them together, it was easy to understand why people believed it. Snowman continued competing successfully for years before eventually retiring from the show ring. Unlike many famous athletes, retirement didn't mean disappearing from public life. Visitors still came to see him. Families brought their children. Many simply wanted to meet the horse whose story had inspired millions. Snowman spent the rest of his life where he had always seemed happiest, on Harry's farm. Not because he had nowhere else to go, because he was already home. In 1974, Snowman passed away at the age of 25. Harry buried him on the farm where they had built their incredible story together. For Harry, losing Snowman wasn't like losing a champion. It was like losing a member of the family. Years later, he still spoke about him with the same affection, not because of the championships, not because of the trophies, but because of the friendship they had shared. Today, Snowman's story is still told around the world. Books have been written about him. A documentary was made about his life. He was inducted into the United States Show Jumping Hall of Fame, ensuring that future generations would remember what he accomplished. But perhaps the most remarkable part of his story isn't found on any trophy. It's found in one simple question. What if Harry had never gone back? What if he had accepted that Snowman simply wasn't good enough? What if he had driven home that day and never looked back? Horse racing and show jumping history would have lost one of their greatest underdog stories. A quiet gray workhorse would have disappeared without anyone ever knowing what he was capable of. Instead, one act of kindness gave the world a legend. An $80 horse became one of America's greatest show jumpers, not because he had the perfect bloodlines, not because he was the most expensive, not because anyone believed in him from the beginning. He became a champion because one person looked at a horse everyone else had given up on and decided he deserved one more chance. Sometimes greatness isn't discovered in a breeding barn. Sometimes it's rescued. And that's how an $80 horse became one of America's greatest show jumpers.